Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. China's top legislature, the NPC, has passed the country's first law to regulate overseas NGOs in China. The law aims to regulate their activities in the country and protect their rights and interests. But does the move bring foreign NGOs more rights or restrictions? What new regulations are there in the new law, and how will it influence NGOs already operating in the country? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Victor Gao, our current affairs commentator, and Anna Tangen, author and columnist. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Passed in a landslide, the new law targets the activities of NGOs founded outside the Chinese mainland. However, exchanges and cooperation between Chinese and overseas colleges, hospitals, and research institutes of science and engineering would not be affected as they follow existing regulations. Many overseas NGOs have engaged in charity and academic exchanges in China and play a positive role. Since their number has grown fast and their activities intensified, lawmakers say that it is necessary to have a law to regulate and guide their activities on finances, including the sources of funds, expenses, and revenues. They should have their financial reports audited and published. Some foreign journalists worry that this will mean more restrictions on foreign NGOs. But Chinese authorities say that this move is a justified one.
The Chinese government always welcomes foreign NGOs to come to China to expand cultural and charity activities, and their achievements are highly spoken of by the Chinese authorities. But there are a few illegal exceptions in which NGOs came to China to harm its national security. We will strengthen supervision on their activities and give due punishment.
Overseas NGOs engaging in illegal activities, such as subverting the state and splitting the nation, will be blacklisted and banned from operating on the mainland. Lawmakers stressed that the basic principle in drafting this law is to combine the regulation with services so as to facilitate NGO operations in China.
Now, gentlemen, obviously this new law targets the activities of NGOs which were founded outside China. Why do you think we have strengthened the regulations targeting overseas NGOs? Many of them have been very active in China.
Definitely, many foreign NGOs have been active in China for years, and many of them actually have been conducting in very noble causes and activities. On the other hand, in China, there is still a fundamental concern that some of the NGOs or members of the NGOs operating in China may be actually working for other agendas. For example, what the Chinese government is very much concerned is any activities to subvert the legitimacy of the government here, or to throw the government over here, or to spread rumors eventually which may arouse tensions in China or hostilities against the ruling party or the government. Now, whether these concerns are justified or not, that's another thing. But the government is apparently very much worried about these NGO activities in China. But now, with this law, I think one positive thing is that foreign NGOs can legally operate in China. That's a good and positive step forward. On the other hand, I think many foreign NGOs and other political forces outside of China are not very happy about the status of this law. But I think let's give the law a try. Let's come back to this law in a few years' time to see whether there will be any need for improvement. On the surface of the law, it's a big step forward. It's positive for China. It's a good thing for foreign NGOs.
I see it slightly differently in terms of the Chinese government is drawing a very bright line between what they say is social progress and trying to help China and what they see as political interference from outside. And they're saying that this is a first draft. Now, this is the second draft of the law. This will be presented. It's been discussed in the past. There are obviously going to be a lot of concerns by foreign
altogether
groups.
3 readings.
Yes. So this will go through another reading. The question is, what will be the feedback going on? It is not that different from the situation that occurred maybe 5 years ago. But you also have to remember, although there are many legal NGOs here in China, there are also a lot of what we call gray NGOs. They're operating, they've been affiliated, but they have not been formally certified. And there's been some questions about ideological, religious-based groups who are not in favor of China's government. And I think very clearly China is saying, look, we're not interested at this time in having groups who are trying to tear our society apart.
The press conference that was hosted on Wednesday last week pointed out clearly that the promulgation of the law serves to provide good services and to enhance governance of the overseas NGOs. Interpretations about the law among and between media players, Chinese and foreign alike, vary greatly, with the Chinese laying more emphasis on the goodwill, but the overseas media say, hey, this amounts to a de facto crackdown on the overseas NGO. Why do we have such strong repercussions from the overseas reporters here?
Well, I would say purely from the international perspective, NGO is very, very active in many developed countries. In Western countries in particular. Now,
the wording of NGO first appeared back in 1945 in the wake of the Second World War on the Economic and Social Council of the UN.
Yeah, whereas in China, the concept of NGO itself was alien to the Chinese system and the Chinese way of doing things. In China, it used to be the case that everything was controlled by the government. So how can you have a non-governmental organization? I think in this sense, even though the foreign counterparties are criticizing the nature of this particular law governing the activities in China of foreign NGOs, they also need to see that, first of all, the concept is now striking deep roots in China. Foreign NGOs are now allowed to operate in China, and they are allowed to engage with their counterparties and conduct activities in China. Even though there may be problems, let's give this law a try and let's readdress those issues in the future.
Consistently, Victor says very clearly that let's give the law some time. Let's wait to see and figure out whether this is a goodwill or like what some of the overseas media describe here as crackdown.
Well, first off, you're not going to convince the overseas media or the NGOs that this is a positive step in terms of their involvement in China. But you also have to look at this from the other perspective, and that is, and Obama in 2014 in May announced it. He said, oh, we won't use NGOs as fronts for our spying activities. This was a bombshell. I mean, yes, everybody knows that this happens, but for the president to announce that we won't do this anymore means it was happening in the past, and the question is it continuing to happen? Cyber espionage is not the only kind of espionage. You also have increased tensions, which are happening right now, especially in the South China Seas, different groups who are advocating different issues. You have Xinjiang, you have Tibet, you have Taiwan, you have Hong Kong. All of these issues are basically pulling China apart. And this is something that I think the Xi Jinping and the government in Beijing is a luxury they cannot afford at this time. They feel very strongly that the economic situation is very important, and that to escape what we call the middle income trap, they need to get beyond this. And that is going to require some sacrifice in the midterm.
A second look at the strong backlashes and repercussions from the overseas media and policymakers may enable you to review what happened in Russia, where President Putin did launch a crackdown on some of the overseas NGOs there whose sources of funding were very questionable according to the Russian sources. Now, do you think we have taken into our consideration lessons that Moscow provides so that we would do whatever we can to avert the alleged color revolution that did take place in some of the developing countries?
Definitely, I think the Chinese government and the legislature not only had looked at what happened in Russia in recent years, but also in many upheavals involving many countries in the Middle East and
Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Ukraine, you name it.
Libya, on the other hand, NGOs can be divided into either advocacy groups or non-advocacy groups. Now, for those which are advocacy groups, their mandate says they need to advocate what they truly believe in. Now, different countries may have very, very different value systems. What you can legally advocate in one country may not be, legal in another country. So there are differences of values at the very, very beginning of the process when we talk about advocacy groups, which form the bulk part of the NGOs to start with. So we need to be very careful about what these NGOs sometimes are allowed to advocate, for example.
Now, Anna, a few minutes ago, Victor said correctly that most of the Chinese here have long felt very comfortable with having a central government, a strong central government. In fact, Lee Kuan Yew, the late founding father of Singapore, said much the same in his book about China. And he made that very clear to the overseas observers who visited him in Singapore. Now, having said this, the point Victor came up with was, since this is described by overseas media as an autocracy as opposed to democracy, it means we don't have much the same form or nature of a civil society, which is supposed to encourage and breed the birth and growth of NGOs. In China, this is a different situation. Therefore, the fact that such a law is promulgated to allow up to 7,000 NGOs to operate in this country itself should be viewed as a very big step in the correct direction. However, this move is seriously questioned by those who are very skeptical about the intent of this law.
Well, the issue is, what is your definition of a civil society? And in the West, we believe that, and very strongly, that there's only one definition. The question is, can you have a civil society in different cultural and political norms? And I think with the emergence of a multipolar world, people are going to have to get used to this. The idea that one size fits all is not working. It has not worked. Democracy has not been the cure-all for a lot of countries, and where you've had violent upsets and democracy has tried to take over, disaster has followed quite quickly. So the question really is, are people able to change and understand that there are different versions of a civil society, and that the basis of a civil society is one in which you can think, live, and prosper in different ways.
Look at the high profile and high-handed crackdown upon rampant corruption, a campaign that was launched by President Xi Jinping after he took office at the 18th National Congress of the CPC. Now, it seems on the one hand, the ruling party of the CPC wants to have a very strong house cleaning campaign to make sure that it's trusted by the general public. On the other hand, with the growing army of the middle class in the olive-shaped society, because China is said to have entered into the middle-income economy, it means the middle class would have a very strong demand for social justice, and many of them may not, pin their hopes only on the government. They say, hey, let's strengthen the democratic oversight. But it has nothing to do directly with the existence and the operations of NGOs. However,
what do you mean
within
by
this broad context,
what do you mean by democratic oversight?
Democratic oversight means
democratic oversight is in India. Has that solved it there?
You just cannot afford
Malaysia.
to have the internal democracy or intra-party democracy. It means, from the Western perspective, you have to exercise such oversight by other watchdogs, such as the independent media and independent
well, who's empowering NGOs
well,
to be the oversight?
Western perspectives. I'm not arguing with you, but I'm stating objectively the Western perceptions about what a democratic oversight should mean.
But if you allow me to add one point, I think China itself is undergoing tremendous amount of transformation. China used to be, ruled single-handedly by the party, and there was no other participation democratic forces in the Chinese politics at all. During the Cultural Revolution, we went to the extreme. Now we are going through very, very fast changes, and the space of the changes is accelerating. And China today will be different if we look at China 5 years from today. So I would say anything is possible in China, but I think collectively we need to also make a firm commitment to avoid falling into a trap or falling into another revolution, for example, plunging the whole Chinese society into great chaos, and the people eventually will suffer, as what has happened in many other countries. Therefore, for the government to try to maintain certain order and maintain stability in China is something that they have to do, because otherwise the opportunity cost or the downside of the other side of the coin will be horrible.
What Victor says is actually a deep thought on the relationship between individual liberty and maintaining law and order in a changing society. But you are watching Dialogue with Anna Tangen and Victor Gao. We're discussing the impact of the latest law on NGOs, I mean overseas NGOs in this country. We shall be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back, gentlemen. Up to 7,000 overseas NGOs are operating in this country of China, and some of them, as Anna said earlier, are grey organizations. They have not been registered with the previously the Civil Affairs Ministry, which took charge of the NGOs. Now the power of the administration and management has been handed over to the Ministry of Public Security. It's this power transfer that has caused much of the criticism from the overseas observers here. Why do you think we have, on the one hand, the operations of Greenpeace, WWF, and Save Children? These are what we call the non-advocacy groups. On the other hand, we have some of the groups which may have been placed under scrutiny.
Yeah, I think this decision to transfer the regulatory power from the Civil Affairs Ministry to the Ministry of Public Security reflects fundamentally the concern on the part of the Chinese government that some of these NGOs may still do bad things, which may cause very, very negative impact on China's political stability and the legitimacy of the ruling party here in China. Now, on the one hand, you can argue whether these concerns are fully justified or not. That's one thing. But on the other hand, I think the fact that the Chinese government wants to leave no stone unturned in their effort to maintain peace and stability at home, so that China and the Chinese people can continue to enjoy the benefit of peace and stability rather than, plunging our society into great chaos. That concern is a legitimate one. Therefore, I think the fact that now the Ministry of Public Security will regulate all these foreign NGOs' activities in China raises the level of scrutiny, because now the Ministry of Public Security and the police officers are authorized to monitor the activities of the foreign NGOs in China, and when they feel it is necessary, they can call the head of the NGO to their office for a reporting, and if they find violations, they can suspend the activities of the foreign NGOs in China, and eventually, even in more serious cases, they can put them on the blacklist. So I would say that the Chinese government is carving out measures and options they can resort to if, for example, they found foul dealings by the foreign NGOs in China. On the part of the foreign NGOs, they may be very unhappy. They say, we are doing legitimate things, and we are advocacy groups or non-advocacy groups, and you should not use the police department to monitor what we do and punish us if they believe we are doing the foul things.
Okay, but on the other hand, there are groups that, NGOs whose mission is to support groups that are antagonistic to the Chinese government, whether it's in Xinjiang or Tibet and things, and these have long been known. I think the important thing to remember here is, if you look at the world today, you have groups out there that insist that they have the right to regulate and impose their values, their systems on you. And whether this is religious or ideological, I think it's very clear that this is not working and that this is the source of strife as we see it today. So I don't necessarily, I've been involved in many NGOs, I've been chairman of them, I think they do a good job, but I always draw a line between what is permissible and what is not. What is advocacy on behalf of values that are not part of my job versus trying to solve a problem that I think everyone wants to get solved. You're a guest here in the
From
end.
the Chinese perspective, Anna, some measures have been rolled out to serve in a positive way the operations of overseas NGOs. For example, The new law removes the restriction of allowing only one office on the Chinese mainland. These organizations will now be able to open offices based on their operational needs, but the number and the locations must be approved by the regulatory authority. The bill also takes away a 5-year limit on operations of representative offices in China. What do you think of these measures?
I think these are positive steps forward. This makes foreign NGOs operating in China with greater flexibility in conducting their affairs. For example, I'm a member of the Global Council of Asia Society, which bills itself as a non-advocacy group. Its mandate is to promote cultural exchanges between United States and many Asian countries. And they wanted to have a license to operate an office here in Shanghai or in Beijing, but that approval has never been granted. I think under the new law, I'm pretty sure Asia Society will soon get an approval, and they can not only set up one office in Shanghai, but possibly here in Beijing or in other cities in which Asia Society may feel they have a legitimate interest to conduct their businesses. On the other hand, for example, NGOs like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, for example, which definitely have their own ideological platform, and they want to advocate, agendas or purposes along ideological lines or political lines, which may or may not be acceptable to the Chinese government or the Chinese political system. And, for example, the Chinese government may decide that they should not be allowed to operate in China. That line of differentiation shall still be respected in China today.
Gentlemen, there are two sides to the same coin as to non-governmental organizations. We have the Chinese ones and the overseas NGOs. Both of them should be treated equally in an age of full opening up, right? In an age of globalization. Now, on one issue has captured the attention of the overseas media, that's taxation. Whether the preferential policies that are applicable in the case of overseas multinationals should be used and should also be applicable in the case of Chinese NGOs. Now, if the overseas NGOs demand more preferential policies to reduce tax for the overseas NGOs, then the Chinese side will demand the same treatment, right? And this is a matter of how to level the playing field. What do you think of these concerns?
Well, if you allow me to use one very quick point, I think the Chinese government, even President Xi Jinping, recently have been promoting the formation and the growth of the non-government affiliated think tanks. It's amazing.
Think tanks.
Think tanks is
fast becoming an emerging political and economic phenomenon in China.
Now, if these non-government affiliated think tanks in China become really live and very dynamic, they need to engage with their foreign counterparties. That's why I think the new law, by allowing foreign NGOs, including think tanks, to come into China, if they do not advocate agendas which are alien or unacceptable to the Chinese government and the Chinese people, then I think they need to cooperate very closely, and we would welcome foreign NGOs to be more and more actively involved in China.
Let's draw a little bit of a distinction.
Yes.
Okay, when you start saying the Chinese government and people, there's a difference between what is culturally alien and then what a government in particular says. All right, because you can have governments that said, "Oh, well, no, we don't want to engage. We're going to allow child slavery," things like that. That's not the system here. It's just we were recently talking about this issue of how you create change, whether you use the Western system where a majority rules or whether you use a consensus system. Asia is different than the United States and Europe. It has evolved differently, and it will continue on its own path. The issue is accepting part of that. It's not a question of agreeing. And I will say, quite frankly, putting the PSB in charge of this is very chilling to a lot of outsiders, because they say, well, this is the police force that we're not used to dealing with. Where's the Ministry of Civil Affairs? Why has this become a police matter? Now, there can be questions about that, but it's really a symbol of how important this is to the administration as it continues right now. And I think there has to be some respect for that. There can be questions, there can be changes later on.
Ministry of Public Security is, of course, an important organization that ensures the law and order. What about the cases in France and the United States? The NGOs, do they have to get registered with the local police stations?
I think in the United States, with which I'm more familiar, I think the threshold of setting up an NGO is much, much lower. And I think they have much greater room of maneuverability and flexibility. However, for example, several things stand out. If you are a non-advocacy group, you cannot advocate. If you are an advocacy group, you need to specify what exactly you want to advocate.
And there are different tax consequences.
Yeah, exactly, different tax consequences. And you cannot deviate from the mandate you are allowed to operate under. Secondly, I think tax is also very well defined and very well tailor-made for the different types of NGOs.
To my knowledge, those NGOs that may be called advocacy ones have to be registered with the police station in France, which is a country known for its strong advocacy of human rights. What do you think of such a requirement, which might be viewed as draconian?
Well, the issue here is each country has its own political system, and they have the freedom to do that. If you want a world which is under one society, Francis Fukuyama, The End of Times, fine, you can advocate for that. But the fact is, we are not the same. We are culturally different. Legally, you have to kind of go with it. In the US, we have a very different system. I've participated in it, I've created nonprofits, but like I said, there are very distinct rules and regulations depending on whether you're doing advocacy or whether you're doing charity.
Before we wrap up this dynamic discussion about the role of overseas NGOs and of course that of the Chinese ones, can you brief us on the positive role, the positive job that NGOs are supposed to do in a civil society or in a transitional economy like China, very quickly?
Well, I think NGOs, if they operate properly, can really deliver a lot of contribution and value to a society. And in China, I hope gradually we will have more and more involvement by the NGOs, both domestic as well as foreign NGOs. And mainly because
in areas like charity, education, environmental
protection,
protection, what else?
Cultural, science, and disaster relief, for example. Basically, wherever human beings conduct their life or activities, there can be rooms for NGOs to operate and to contribute and to thrive and prosper. And the impact created by NGOs will be actually very, very positive unless they violate the approved and authorized mandate that they need to be operating under.
30 seconds for you, Anna.
NGOs, as good Samaritans, are always welcome. And the question is, if they're trying to overthrow the existing government or order, then they become problematic. Yeah. And this does not matter if it's China or anybody anywhere else. You could have the same problems if you're an Islamic group that's trying to advocate for ISIL in the United States. The issue is where you draw the boundaries and the freedom to draw those boundaries by each country. By
the end of the day, we'll repeat the same question, whether the Chinese society will become more inclusive in forming a civil society of our own characteristics. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.